I'm assuming you know about the 12 principles of animation if you're watching a video about straight ahead action and pose to pose. If you don't already, I suggest you go and Google it. I might make videos about the 12 principles at some point in the future, but the point is that I haven't yet. So if you don't know about them, go ahead, look it up, just so that you can actually know. If you're at all interested in being an animator or animation, then you should definitely know about the 12 principles. Anyway, before I digress too much, straight ahead action and pose to pose are one of the 12 principles of animation. There are basically two ways or approaches to animating. You can use one or the other, or you can use a saucy combination of both. So basically, straight ahead action is when you start animating on keyframe 1, and then you just carry on going straight ahead like that. So you do keyframe 2, keyframe 3, keyframe 4, rather than laying down your key poses, say on keyframe 1, and then your next key pose on keyframe 5, and then your next key pose on frame 15, and then going back and filling in the extremes and the breakdowns and the in-betweens, which is pose to pose. So straight ahead action is when you just go straight ahead from keyframe 1 and you just carry on doing the very next keyframe for that pose, rather than pose to pose, which is doing key pose to key pose and then going back and filling in those in-between keyframes. It can be fun and spontaneous and creatively freeing to work with straight ahead action because you kind of just go with the flow and you see where the scene takes you as you animate. But on the other hand, it's very difficult to manage your time and hit certain beats and points in your scene that you might need to without that structure that pose to pose can give you. Also, professionally speaking, so I'm not talking about if you're a hobbyist or something, but professionally, if you're in a studio environment or if you are one of the people in that pipeline of animation where you have a director above you who still needs to see your stuff and give you feedback on it, or a client or whatever, it can be very difficult to work that way because if you're working with straight ahead, you need to finish animating your entire scene first before someone can see it and give you feedback on it. So they can only give you any feedback when it's completely done, and it can be very difficult to then go back and make changes because if you need to change one keyframe, you need to change every other keyframe before that and after that as well because they're all affected. And the scene can also tend to sort of drag on forever because there's no set ending for you to get to. You just animate onwards until it's done. So there's nothing that you can sort of work towards because you don't know when it's done. It's done when it's done. You also can't have more than one animator working on a scene at a time. So usually you would have a lead animator sort of setting the key poses, and then, they would maybe go and do the extremes or the breakdowns, but then they would give that to another animator who would go and do the in-betweens for them while they work on something else. But with straight ahead action, you can't do that. You've got one animator working on it straight ahead as they go. You can't split up that scene between other animators or senior and junior animators or anything like that. So it can be difficult to work with in that regard as well. With pose to pose, it's obviously, as I mentioned, it's easier to plan with regards to timing, and you can really fine tune your scene and your poses a lot more because you work on refining those key poses first before you go back and do all the rest of the keyframe. It's more reliable and it's easier to manage your time because it's such a structured way of working. You have full control over your scene. It's definitely preferred in a professional production setting because you go and you lay out your key poses first and then you can send that to your director, get some feedback on that, tweak that a little bit more, go back, get feedback, then you get approval on that, and then you can go and you do your extremes and your breakdowns, and you keep going with that back and forth all the way throughout your project rather than animating an entire scene and then getting changes that you have to go back and make and tweak in a fully animated scene, which is really, really difficult. It's much easier to work with pose to pose when you've still got your very simple key poses and keyframes laid down to go back and make changes to timing or poses and stuff like that. But, some people do argue that pose to pose is less natural and it looks more rigid because you don't get to go with the flow creatively as much. It does have less flow in the movement as well sometimes. So there are pros and cons to both methods. But you also have the option of using both in your scene, which is what a lot of professional animators do. They don't rigidly stick to either one or the other. So you can map out your key poses with pose to pose and you can do your extremes and your breakdowns, but then for the in-betweens you can go and you can use straight ahead action and just sort of freestyle and see what fits in there. And if you need to tweak the poses that you laid down in your pose to pose stage, that's totally okay. It's really easy to do with that pose to pose workflow, but you're still bringing in some of that natural feeling and creative flow that you get with straight ahead action. So it can still end up having that really nice flow and that creatively freeing feeling, but you still have the structure of the pose to pose that you laid down beforehand. But there are some situations where it is better to use straight ahead just by nature of what you're animating. For example, if you're doing something like fluids or fire or smoke, stuff that's really organic and unpredictable, and obviously in this case I'm talking about 2D animation, not if you're making fluid or fire simulations, obviously. But actually, Simulations technically are straight ahead anyway, it's just that you're not manually animating them as straight ahead. So it's stuff where it needs to be more organic, less predictable, less rigid, then straight ahead action is really great to use. It's great to be spontaneous and just go with the flow when you're animating something like water or an explosion, because it's not something that needs to keep its form or volume the entire time. It can have those variations from frame to frame, and it ends up looking more natural in that case. It's actually really difficult to plan that with pose to pose, and it will end up looking stiff and much less organic because they are such unpredictable things that you need to animate. So trying to use structure and rigidity with that actually ends up backfiring. Straight ahead action can also be useful when animating overlapping action. So if your character has long hair or floppy ears or like a swishy dress, you can plan out the main action with pose to pose and then do another pass after that, once you have the timing and poses down, to then do the overlapping action with straight ahead action so it feels more organic and fluid. Pose to pose is generally better to use with most other things, especially with characters and creatures like that need to maintain their form, especially when you're doing it with traditional 2D animation, when you're drawing the frames out. With straight ahead action, it's very difficult to maintain that form and keep them on model sometimes and maintain that volume from frame to frame, because you're looking at it very closely and you don't have those points that you need to reach between the two. You're just going from one to the other, and a character can tend to shrink or increase in size when you're using straight ahead action in those situations. Also, when you have a particular scene where you need to hit specific beats for the storytelling or the acting, the emotion of the scene, anything like that, or there's a certain choreography you need to work with, especially when there's two characters interacting in a scene or something like that, or if there's a specific action that they need to do between one point and another, then it's much better to use pose to pose. It's good to get an idea of what your animation is going to look like early on with pose to pose and see the timing of it, rather than spending days and days animating something that ends up looking like total shit that you have to scratch and redo from the start. Generally speaking, when animating a scene, you do have certain specs for the scene that you need to achieve. Like, for example, you might have a character that needs to walk angrily across the room, go to a table, pick up a glass, and throw it against a wall. If you're animating that straight ahead, the character could take forever to get to the table, and then their walk ends up looking more lazy than angry because of the timing of the piece. And then they might pick up the glass and end up throwing it out the window because the arc and the spacing was totally out of whack with the straight ahead animation. Or he could start out really big, and as he walks, he just gradually decreases in size because it's really difficult to maintain size with straight ahead action. Obviously, if you've been animating for 30 years and you're some amazing animation guru or some prodigy, and you have this innate sense of timing and proportions and spacing, and you can animate something incredibly with straight ahead action, then more power to you. I sincerely hope that I can be just like you when I grow up. But for the rest of us, the average masses, it's good to have that structure that you get from animating with pose to pose. Some animation is obviously more abstract, more conceptual, and then cool, straight ahead action would be great to use, especially if you want something very flowy and organic looking. You see what I'm saying? Both these methods have their time and their place. It's just good to know exactly when that time and place is, because they benefit very different things. As you animate more, you get more comfortable with knowing just instinctively which one is the best approach to use for that particular scene that you're working on, or whether you need to use a combination of both. Of course, this whole time I've been talking about 2D or 3D animation. Obviously, different types of animation have different approaches. If you're doing stop motion animation, then you basically have to animate with straight ahead action. So if you want to argue that point, then I fully do acknowledge that other types of animation do have different approaches. You just need to think practically about what approach will best suit your form of animation. I hope that helped you if you were wondering, when to use one or the other. It does become easier as you animate more. Let me know in the comments what your approach is. Do you prefer one or the other, or do you use a combination of both like I do? Thank you as always to my patrons. I really appreciate the support from you guys. And if the rest of you didn't know, I do have a Patreon set up where I give monthly feedback to some of my tiers. I share works in progress and other useful links and articles and stuff that I find online. And I'm just trying to grow a really nice supportive community over there. If you're not subscribed yet, it's just a little click away. If you want to keep up to date with my videos, you can always just hit the bell notification over there so you don't miss out on any others. Give the video a like if you do like it. It really helps out with the algorithm. And thanks for watching, guys. Love ya. Bye.